I moved into my new apartment in Sacramento on the first week of March. The building was old but clean, the kind of place that carried its history in the creak of the walls and the faint scent of chlorine that lingered in the air like it had soaked into the bricks decades ago. The pool was the first thing I noticed. It sat in the courtyard like an enormous mirror, perfectly still, framed by faded blue tiles that had lost their shine years ago. The water was crystal clear, yet there was something in its stillness that felt wrong, as if it was not resting but waiting. Every afternoon I passed it on my way back from work. At first it felt inviting. Warm California sunlight glittered on its surface, the quiet hum of traffic muffled by the high courtyard walls. Yet each time I stopped to look at it, I felt an odd pull, as if the water itself was leaning toward me. There was a sign bolted to the rusted gate. Pool closes at 6 p.m., no exceptions. The words were hand-painted, uneven, and too large, as though whoever made it wanted to shout the rule into the bones of anyone who read it. I thought it was strange. Every pool I had known closed much later, especially in a city where nights stayed warm long after sunset. On my second week, I finally decided to swim. I arrived at 5:30. The pool was empty, silent. I slid the latch open and stepped inside the gate. The air was heavy, thicker than outside the courtyard. I could hear my own footsteps echo on the cement. The water was perfectly calm. Not a single leaf floated on its surface. No sound except the low hum of the filter. I swam for 15 minutes, the cool water wrapping around me like glass. There was something hypnotic about the stillness beneath the surface. No drifting shadows, no wavering light, just an endless clear depth that seemed deeper than it had any right to be. At exactly 5:45, a tall man entered through the far gate. He wore a plain white shirt and red shorts. His face was pale, almost sickly in the fading sunlight. He did not smile when he saw me. "Time to leave," he said without raising his voice. I glanced at the clock on the clubhouse wall. It was not 6 yet. He repeated himself, "Time to leave." His voice was flat, without emotion. I climbed out of the water, my skin prickling against the cooling air. As I wrapped my towel around me, I noticed something strange. His eyes did not follow me as I walked to the gate. They were fixed on the water, unblinking. I left the courtyard, the metal gate closing behind me with a heavy clang. The next evening, I came back at the same time. The same thing happened. 15 minutes alone in the pool, the tall man arriving at 5:45 exactly, his eyes fixed on the water. By the fourth day, I started to feel watched, even before he arrived. When my head went under the water, I would hear faint sounds like the echo of voices far away. But when I surfaced, the courtyard was silent. On the fifth day, I decided to stay until the last possible second. At 5:45, he entered again, silent, pale, moving toward the deep end of the pool. This time he did not tell me to leave. He just stood there, looking down into the water. I treaded water near the middle, feeling a slow current brush against my legs. The surface rippled slightly, though there was no wind. The current grew stronger, circling me. I turned toward the man, but his gaze had not moved from the center of the pool. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. The water felt colder. The current wrapped around my legs like something alive. My chest tightened. I swam quickly to the ladder and climbed out, my breath sharp in my throat. The man stepped back from the edge, his expression blank, as if nothing had happened. "Pool closes at 6, he said quietly, almost to himself. That night, I could not sleep. I kept hearing the faint sound of water moving, the same rhythm I felt in the pool. My apartment was on the third floor, but the sound seemed to come from right outside my door, slow and steady like something waiting. I told myself it was nothing. The next day, I returned again. It was 5:32 when I unlocked the gate. The courtyard felt heavier than usual, the air damp and cold despite the sun still high above the building walls. The water was calm, too calm. I walked to the edge, crouched down, and peered into the deep end. Something shifted far below the surface. Not a ripple, not a shadow from the clouds. Something moved. The movement in the water stopped as quickly as it began. I stayed crouched, staring into the deep end, my pulse thudding in my ears. The water was clear, but the depth seemed darker than it should have been, a slow shadow pooling at the bottom like ink spreading under glass. I leaned closer. The shadow shifted again. A shape emerged just far enough for my eyes to make out the curve of a face. pale skin, unmoving, hair floating gently around it as if suspended in a slow current. My breath caught, the face turned upward. I stumbled back from the edge so quickly that my heel slipped against the wet tiles. My shoulder hit the ground hard, a sharp sting shooting down my arm. The water rippled softly as if disturbed by nothing at all. I forced myself to stand, my towel still in hand, trying to steady my breath. The surface was calm again, empty. I told myself I had imagined it. Light, water, fatigue, my mind filling in shapes that were not there. But as I turned to leave, I saw him again. The tall man stood at the opposite gate, the same pale shirt, the same red shorts, his face as still as the water. "It is not time yet," I said without thinking. He did not respond. His eyes were fixed on the water again. I felt my mouth go dry. I left without swimming. That night, the sound of water came again. Louder. Closer. It was not just a slow trickle now. It was the sound of something brushing against the surface, the soft disturbance of movement just below. I pressed my ear to the apartment floor. It was coming from below me. The next day, I told myself I would not go back. At 4:30, I was standing at my window looking down at the courtyard. The pool glistened faintly in the light, perfectly still, as if nothing had ever been wrong. At 5 o'clock, I was at the gate. The latch felt colder than it should have been, metal biting into my palm. The air inside the courtyard was heavier than before, thick like a summer storm, but the sky above was clear. I set my towel on the same chair as always. The surface of the pool mirrored the pale blue of the evening sky. I stepped to the edge of the deep end again. This time there was no shadow, no movement. I eased myself into the water. It was colder than usual, sending a shock up my spine. I swam slowly, my body cutting clean lines across the surface. The water felt thicker, as though I was moving through something heavier than liquid. Halfway through my lap, I felt it again. The current. It brushed against my ankles softly, then again stronger. I stopped, treading water. The ripples came from directly beneath me, slow circles spreading outward. I took a breath and dove down. The water swallowed the sunlight quickly. At first, all I saw was the pale blue tiles blurring into shadow. Then I saw it. An eye, not just a reflection, not a trick of the light. A human eye, wide open, staring straight up at me from the center of the deep end. I gasped and my breath escaped in a cloud of silver bubbles. I kicked hard for the surface. When I broke into the air, I was not alone. Something was holding the edge of the pool. Fingers, pale, thin, gripping the tiles. They slid back into the water before I could move. I scrambled to the ladder and climbed out, my chest heaving, my limbs trembling. The tall man was standing at the gate again. This time he spoke. "You should not look down." Then he turned and walked away. The words followed me out of the courtyard. "You should not look down." That night I sat in my apartment staring at the ceiling, the faint sound of water returning once again. This time it was not a gentle current. It was rhythmic, like someone swimming slow laps directly beneath me. I tried to drown it out with the hum of the fan, the noise from the street outside. But no matter what I did, the sound pushed through, steady, deliberate. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of the pool. It was night. No lights in the courtyard, only the pale reflection of the moon rippling on the surface. I was standing at the edge. Something moved in the water. Hands reached out from the deep end, pale and thin, gripping the edge just like I'd seen before. They pulled and a head rose slowly into view. Wet hair clung to a face that was too pale, lips parted in a smile that did not belong to anything living. The smile widened until it was impossibly wide, the corners of the mouth stretching almost to the ears. A voice, low and cold, spoke without the lips moving. "It is 6 o'clock. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The next day I told myself I would not go near the pool. By 5:30 I was walking toward the courtyard. The gate was already unlocked. Inside, the air felt heavier than it ever had. A faint mist hovered just above the surface of the water, though the sun was still visible over the rooftops. I looked around for the tall man. He was not there. The pool was silent. I stepped to the edge and stared down into the deep end. The water shimmered faintly in the light. No shadow, no shape. Then I noticed something strange. The clock on the clubhouse wall. The second hand was moving slower than it should. I glanced down at my watch. It was 5:35. I looked back at the clubhouse clock. It read 5:42. The second hand ticked again, almost hesitating. I turned back to the water. A pale shape moved at the bottom. Not a face this time, a full figure. It was lying flat against the tiles as though resting on the floor of the pool. Its limbs were long, too long, stretched out at unnatural angles. Its head turned upward. I stepped back. The figure began to rise, slow and smooth, as if the water itself was pushing it upward. I stumbled away from the edge, my heart pounding. The tall man appeared at the far gate. His pale face was expressionless. "You cannot stay after 6, he said. I glanced at the clubhouse clock again. The second hand ticked forward. 5:45. The figure in the water was closer now, just beneath the surface, its face pale and smiling. I turned toward the gate, but the latch was locked. The man was gone. I turned back to the water. The surface broke. A pale hand gripped the edge, water streaming from between its fingers. Another hand followed. The head rose slowly into view, hair plastered across the pale skin, the same impossible smile curving across its face. It was 6 o'clock. The clock on the clubhouse wall ticked once more, then stopped. The pale figure pulled itself higher, the water sliding from its shoulders in slow streams. Its smile did not move. Its eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking. I stumbled backward until my spine hit the metal fence. My breath came sharp and fast, the cold air cutting my throat. The figure's hands gripped the edge tighter. Then it stopped. It did not climb out. It just stayed there, head tilted slightly. That smile stretched far beyond human. The clock on the clubhouse wall had not moved. 6 o'clock, frozen. I turned to the gate. The latch was locked. I twisted it hard, metal biting into my palm. The latch would not move. I yanked harder. It stayed in place, cold and solid, like it was part of the wall itself. Behind me, the water rippled. I turned back. The figure was gone. The surface was smooth again, like nothing had ever been there. The silence pressed against my ears. I took a step toward the chair where I'd left my towel. My foot touched water. I looked down. A thin sheet of water was spreading across the tiles, seeping outward from the edge of the pool. I stepped back, but the water followed, crawling slowly toward me in a thin trail. I moved to the other side of the courtyard, my shoes squeaking against the wet ground. The water was still following, winding in a narrow path like it had chosen me. I reached the far gate. It was locked too. The clock still read 6 o'clock. The mist above the pool grew thicker. The air felt heavier, colder. Then I heard it. A splash. I turned back. Something broke the surface in the deep end. Not the pale figure. Something larger. A shape rose slowly, dark and massive, its outlines shifting as though the water itself was shaping it. The sound of water grew louder, a low rumble filling the courtyard. The shape moved toward the shallow end, silent except for the rising current. I backed up until my shoulders pressed against the gate, my hands gripping the cold metal. The water at my feet was deeper now, pooling around my shoes. The shape stopped. Then the surface went still again. The mist thickened until I could barely see the opposite side of the pool. From somewhere inside the fog, a voice spoke. You looked down. I pressed myself harder against the gate, my breath shaking. The voice came again, closer. Now you cannot leave. The water surged forward, cold and sudden, rising past my ankles. I gripped the gate harder, twisting the latch again. This time it turned. The gate swung open. I stumbled out onto the pavement, cold water streaming from my clothes. When I turned back, the courtyard was empty. The mist was gone. The water was still. The clock read 5:58. I stayed away from the pool for 2 days, but the water never stayed away from me. The sound followed me through the walls, slow waves against the tiles, splashes that came at the same time every evening. I could feel it at night. A faint cold dampness creeping through the floor as though the water was searching for a way in. On the 3rd day, I saw him. The tall man in the white shirt and red shorts. Only this time, he was not at the pool. He was standing in the hallway outside my apartment. He did not knock. He did not speak. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on my door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. I could not ignore it anymore. I needed to know who he was. I went down to the manager's office. The blinds were drawn, the door locked. A faded note was taped to the glass. Out until Monday. Someone else was in the hallway. A man I had seen before on the 2nd floor. Heavy-set, middle-aged, wearing a plain flannel shirt. He stopped when he saw me. His eyes darted toward the courtyard, then back to me. You hear it too, he said quietly. I froze. Hear what? I asked. He looked toward the manager's office again, then stepped closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. The water. My stomach turned cold. He glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. Come by my place after sunset. 2B. Do not go near the pool until then. He walked away without another word. That evening, I stood outside his door. The hallway was quiet, but I could feel something in the air, a heaviness that grew stronger as the clock ticked towards 6. He opened the door before I could knock. Get inside, he said. His apartment was dim, the blinds drawn tight. A faint smell of chlorine lingered in the air. He motioned for me to sit. I have lived here 12 years, he said. I have seen people come and go. Most do not stay long. I asked him why. He looked at me for a long time before speaking again, because of the pool. I told him about the pale figure, the voice, the locked gates. His expression did not change. You saw it because you stayed too long, he said. I asked what it was. He shook his head slowly. Nobody knows exactly, but it is older than this building, older than this city. He stood and crossed the room to a small cabinet. Inside were stacks of old photographs. He handed me one. It showed the courtyard, decades earlier. The pool was there, the tiles newer, the water the same, still blue. At the edge of the deep end stood the tall man in the white shirt and red shorts. My breath caught. He looked exactly the same. That is why the gates lock at 6, the man in 2B said. That is why you cannot look down. I asked what happens if someone stays after 6. His eyes shifted to the door as if listening for something outside. You will not be able to leave, he said quietly. The sound of water echoed faintly in the hallway, and sometimes you do not come back. The words from 2B stayed with me all night. You will not be able to leave. And I told myself I would stay away from the pool. I told myself I believed him. By the next evening, I was standing at the gate at 5:45. The courtyard was silent. No sign of the tall man. No sound of water. The clock on the clubhouse wall ticked steadily towards 6. I stepped inside. The air felt heavier than before, pressing against my skin. The water lay perfectly still, a smooth glass surface reflecting the pale sky. I walked to the edge of the deep end. Nothing moved beneath the surface. The clock ticked. 5:58, 5:59, 6 o'clock. The second hand stopped. The air shifted, colder now, like a sudden windless storm had settled over the courtyard. I turned toward the gate. It was locked. I tried the other gate. Locked. The water rippled softly, though nothing had touched it. I looked back at the deep end. A pale shape floated just below the surface. It was closer this time, almost as if it was waiting for me to notice. I took a step back. The ripples grew wider, spreading toward the shallow end. Then I saw them. Hands. 2 pale hands reaching up from the deep end, fingers stretching unnaturally long. They gripped the edge of the pool and pulled. A head rose slowly from the water, hair clinging wet to the pale face. The smile was wider now, teeth faintly visible beneath the stretched lips. It climbed higher, water streaming from its shoulders. Its arms were too long, the joints bending at angles that made my stomach twist. I backed toward the gate, pulling at the latch again. The figure stepped onto the tiles, water pooling around its bare feet. It tilted its head, eyes fixed on mine. You look down, it said. Its voice was low, almost a whisper, but it filled the courtyard. I stumbled back until my shoulder hit the wall. The figure moved closer, slow, deliberate steps echoing on the wet tiles. The water at its feet spread across the ground, reaching toward me. I pressed harder against the wall, my breath coming sharp and fast. The figure stopped just a few feet away. Its smile widened again. You cannot leave. The water surged forward, cold and sudden, climbing over my shoes, my ankles, my knees. I gasped at the shock, pushing against the wall. The figure reached out, its long fingers curling toward my face. The moment its hand was about to touch me, the gate latch clicked. I turned. The gate was open. I stumbled out, falling onto the pavement outside. When I looked back, the courtyard was empty. The figure was gone. The water was still. The clock read 5:58. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale figure stepping out of the water, its smile fixed, its voice echoing in my head. You cannot leave. By morning, I knew I had to talk to the man in 2B again. When I knocked on his door, he opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting. You went back, he said flatly. I stepped inside. His apartment was darker than before. The blinds were closed, the air heavy with the faint smell of damp stone. I told him everything. The gate, the figure, the voice. He listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on me in a way that made me feel like he was weighing every word. When I finished, he turned toward the small cabinet again. From inside, he pulled a thin envelope. He placed it on the table between us. Inside were more photographs, the courtyard, the pool, people I did not recognize. Each photo looked older than the last, the tiles slowly fading, the furniture changing, but the water always the same, still blue. In every photograph, the tall man was there, sometimes at the gate, sometimes near the deep end, always the same white shirt, always the same red shorts. "He has not aged," the man in 2B said quietly. I asked who he was. The man in 2B looked at me for a long time before answering. "Nobody knows his name. He was here before the building." I asked how that was possible. "Because the pool was here first," he said. My chest tightened. He reached into the envelope again and pulled out a single photograph, different from the others. It showed the same courtyard, but older. The tiles cracked, the buildings around it still under construction. The water in the pool was dark, almost black. At the edge of the deep end stood the pale figure, the same stretched smile, the same unblinking eyes, and standing beside it was the tall man. His hand rested on the figure's shoulder. "You cannot leave after 6, the man in 2B said again. "Because after 6, it is not a pool anymore." I felt the air in the room grow heavier. The faint sound of water echoed through the wall. I could not stop thinking about that last photograph. The pale figure standing beside the tall man, his hand resting on its shoulder, almost gentle. The man in 2B said he was keeping it trapped, but the photograph told a different story. I decided I needed answers. The next day, I went to the public records office in downtown Phoenix. The woman at the desk gave me a tired look when I asked about Complex's history. She disappeared into the back for a long time before returning with a thin, dusty file. Most of it was permits, construction plans, zoning requests, but at the very bottom was something older. A newspaper clipping from 1954. Local builder halts project after accident at pool. The photo was grainy, but I recognized the courtyard. The pool was already there, the buildings half finished around it. The article mentioned a worker falling into the deep end during construction. His body was never recovered. The project was delayed for months. I flipped to the back of the file. Tucked between 2 permits was something that did not look official, a hand-drawn map. The pool was at the center, but instead of pipes or filters beneath it, the map showed a series of narrow channels, winding down into black ink. At the bottom was a single word, written in shaky handwriting: endless. I stared at it for a long time before closing the file. When I left the records office, the sun was already low in the sky. By the time I reached the complex, the courtyard was quiet. The tall man was standing by the gate. His pale eyes followed me as I walked past. I could feel the air shift as I crossed the courtyard. The faint smell of chlorine mixed with something older, heavier, like damp stone. I glanced at the pool. For a moment, it looked deeper than it should, the bottom fading into a darkness that did not belong to water. The tall man spoke, his voice low and even. "It is almost 6. I walked faster, but my eyes kept drifting back to the deep end. For just a second, I thought I saw something looking up at me from the darkness. Not the pale figure, something larger. The map stayed in my head all night. Endless. By midnight, I could not resist anymore. The courtyard was silent when I stepped outside. The air was colder, heavier, as though the whole building was holding its breath. The gates were locked, but I had learned by now that locks meant nothing after dark. I pressed the latch. It clicked open. The smell of chlorine was stronger than usual, sharp enough to sting my eyes. The water was perfectly still, no ripples, no reflection of the moon, just a flat surface like black glass. I walked to the edge of the deep end. It looked wrong. The bottom was not visible. The blue tiles were gone, replaced by a darkness that seemed to move slightly, as though it was breathing. I lowered myself onto my knees, leaning closer. The surface rippled faintly, though I had not touched it. I took a breath and dipped my hand into the water. It was cold. Too cold. The chill climbed up my arm into my shoulder, settling deep in my chest. I pulled my hand back. My skin was pale, almost colorless. The water was still again. Then I saw it. A shape rising from the darkness, slow and steady. Not the pale figure, not the tall man. Something larger. The surface broke. A pale hand, huge and smooth, reaching upward. The fingers were long, too long, each tipped with a faint curve like claws. I stumbled back, my heel slipping on the wet tile. The hand hovered just above the surface, drops of black water sliding from its fingertips. Another hand emerged, then the top of a head. Its skin was slick, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth too large, filled with rows of small, sharp teeth. It moved as though it was climbing, but the water did not rise with it. I turned toward the gate. The latch did not move. The sound of water grew louder, rushing in my ears, echoing in my chest. I turned back. The creature was closer, its shoulders visible now, water streaming from its body. Behind it, deep in the black water, dozens of shapes moved, pale, slow, shifting in the darkness. The water surged forward, spilling over the tiles, rushing toward me. I ran to the other gate, my hands slick on the metal latch. It clicked open. I stumbled out, falling onto the pavement outside. The water stopped at the edge of the gate. When I looked back, the deep end was empty. The surface was still. The clock on the clubhouse wall read 5:58. I could not keep pretending it was my imagination. The pool was not just dangerous, it was wrong. The next morning, I went back to 2B. I pounded on the door until the man opened it. His face was pale, his eyes tired. "You went at midnight," he said. I told him what I saw, the hands, the shapes beneath, the way the water stopped at the gate. He listened without surprise. "That is why it can never be drained," he said quietly. I asked him what was down there. He walked to the cabinet, pulled out a single photograph. It was the same courtyard, the same pool. Only this time, the water was gone. The deep end was not a bowl of concrete and tile. It was a shaft descending into darkness. No bottom, just blackness. They built the apartments around it because they thought they could cover it, he said. But it has always been there. I asked about the tall man. He stared at me for a long time before answering. "Someone has to stay," he said. "Someone has to keep it quiet." My stomach tightened. "You mean he is guarding it," I said. The man in 2B shook his head. "Not guarding, feeding." The air in the room felt colder. He stepped closer. "You ever wonder why the gates open for you? Why the clock changes?" My mouth went dry. "Because it lets you in," he said. I turned toward the door, but he caught my wrist. His grip was cold, too strong. I saw something in his eyes I had not seen before. Fear. "Do not be here after 6 tonight," he said. I pulled away and left. That evening I packed my things. I planned to leave before dark. But when I stepped into the hallway, the tall man was there. He stood at the end, still in the white shirt and red shorts. His eyes followed me as I walked toward the stairs. The air grew heavier with each step. When I reached the courtyard, the gates to the pool were open. The pale figure stood at the edge of the deep end, its smile wide. Behind it, in the water, I saw more faces. Dozens of them. Some looked like the photographs from 2B's apartment. Some looked like people I had seen around the building. One of them looked like me. I stepped back. The tall man was behind me now. His hand rested on my shoulder. "Someone has to stay," he said. The water surged forward. I felt the cold climb my legs, my chest, my throat. When I looked down, my reflection was smiling. The apartment was quiet when I moved in. The landlord said nothing about the previous tenant, only that the place had been vacant for a short while. The pool was beautiful, the water so still, so perfectly blue. On my second day, I noticed an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single photograph, the courtyard, the pool, a figure in a white shirt and red shorts standing at the gate, and just at the edge of the deep end, half in shadow, was someone else. They were smiling. On the back of the photograph was a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. "Soll not be here after 6.